Hey everyone! Tonight, we're pulling back the gilded curtain of the Tudor court to reveal the 6 most horrifying hygiene habits of Queen Elizabeth I, smearing decaying meat masks on her face, soaking in vats of fermented urine, constantly changing fresh undergarments, instead of bathing, applying white lead facial masks, Venetian ceruse, painting her lips with mercury-laden cinnabar, and scrubbing her teeth with a charcoal and honey mixture you won't make it through without wincing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Amid the resplendent lights of the Tudor court, where ceremony and power intertwined, Queen Elizabeth I shone like an unfading jewel. She was known by many titles: Gloriana, the legendary queen; Virgin Queen, the chaste monarch; Good Queen Bess; and Fairy Queen. Each nickname carried its own tale, an image woven by courtiers and scholars alike to exalt her as the ultimate embodiment of English identity. Her diplomatic skill, mastery of language, and unwavering belief in her mission to protect the realm elevated Elizabeth to an almost sacred status, so that anyone stepping across the palace threshold could feel the invisible spell she cast. Yet behind the gleaming mask of mirrors, the pearl-draped robes, and the white powder concealing her face, there lay a person driven by calculation, fear, and a relentless desire for control. Elizabeth, who had witnessed her mother accused of weakness, feared that the slightest sign of corporeal frailty might be seized upon as a crack in her authority. She understood that in the highest echelons of royalty, a single drop of water on the skin, a stain on silk, or even an odd scent could leave a lasting negative impression and erode the immortal illusion she had so painstakingly constructed. Therefore, rather than entrust her cleansing to fresh water, she adopted measures so bizarre they send shivers down the spine. Few knew that to avoid the bad air believed to carry disease, Elizabeth instituted an appallingly grotesque hygiene regimen. 6 daily practices, no matter how agonizing or body-destroying, were kept strictly within court walls: smearing her face with fermented meat to draw out toxins, bathing in vats of aged urine to disinfect her skin, endlessly changing fresh undergarments instead of bathing, cleansing with toxic white lead face masks, Venetian ceruse, painting her lips with mercury-laden cinnabar for a brilliant red hue, and finally, scrubbing her teeth with an abrasive charcoal and honey paste to remove plaque. Merely imagining the stench of rotten meat, the thick yellow liquid, or the powdery white lead covering the delicate skin of a monarch is enough to make anyone cringe. Yet the truly terrifying aspect is not these acts themselves, but the mindset driving them. Each time Elizabeth applied a meat mask, she was not only purging imaginary impurities, but affirming her power, transforming rotting flesh into a weapon against illness. Immersion in fermented urine allowed her to feel the warmth of microbial action upon her skin, a unique form of royal medical art. Constantly changing her undergarments was more than hygiene. It was a ritual proclaiming, "Nobility never touches filth," a boundary she enforced rigorously. Moreover, by accepting the pain of a white lead mask, Elizabeth sacrificed her skin's natural integrity to maintain a flawless pallor. The cinnabar on her lips, though strikingly red, tore at her delicate lip tissue with each application, and the supposedly clean charcoal and honey dental scrub actually eroded her enamel, turning her once powerful voice into a rattle of loose, ragged teeth. Through it all, one sees the monarch's deep fear of being defeated by her own body, so profound that she risked her life rather than allow corporeal frailty to tarnish her being. Thus, when one gazes upon her solemn portraits, eyes shining with determination, face seemingly unlined, one glimpses a strength forged in hidden anxiety. The silence of her regal gowns and the grandeur of court ceremony are but a facade masking unspoken dread. Elizabeth believed that only by preserving the flawless illusion before the public could her reign remain unshakable. So long as the rituals of rotten meat masks, urine baths, and lead powder applications were carried out precisely, she felt secure, standing atop an unassailable tower. To outsiders, these bizarre practices might provoke horror or ridicule, yet for Elizabeth, they were strategic choices. Choose pain to avoid weakness. Embrace horror to deter criticism, and destroy flesh to preserve authority. True power did not reside solely in sword or army, but in transforming even personal hygiene into a bond that compelled her court to obey without question. In this article, we will peel back each layer of that illusion, penetrate the walls of urine vats and clouds of lead dust, and fully experience the fear, ambition, and quest for immortality of an extraordinary queen. Each dreadful hygiene ritual offers a vivid window into Elizabeth I's psyche, an empress who befriended terror so that her sovereignty might never fade. Following the veil of power that Elizabeth painstakingly constructed, her first horrifying ritual reveals a dark corner of her soul. Horrifying Ritual 1, the rotten meat face mask. The Tudor palace lay silent as a forest before a storm, broken only by the heavy footfalls of servants and the whisper of wind through narrow leaded windows. In that moment, Elizabeth closed her eyes and felt the chamber's stillness pressing upon her, an invisible force tightening every scheme within her mind. Outside the great hall, flickering lanterns swayed, and flames danced across cold stone walls, as if beckoning forth the latent fears lurking in her heart. The ingredients for the rotten meat mask were prepared with meticulous care in the royal kitchens, prime cuts of beef or lamb, strangely set aside in a dark corner to air out under moonlight and chill winds for days. Natural fermentation turned the flesh into a foul wound of decay, mingling the scent of damp smoke and withered herbs. When a servant brought the tray of soured meat into her chamber, the thick stench clung to the air like a murky shroud around Elizabeth. Seated before an intricately carved ebony dressing table, her face illuminated by candlelight, Elizabeth felt her index finger tremble as the rancid odor assaulted her nerves. Yet she set her jaw and focused on the ritual. The servant peeled back the covering from the tray, then used a wooden spoon to blend the meat with dried rosemary leaves, leona blossoms, and a few drops of almond oil, ingredients believed to balance the fermentation and spare her skin from excessive damage. Once the mixture reached a smooth, pliable consistency, they wrapped a clean cloth around her neck to catch any oozing slime, then gently applied the mask across her visage. Elizabeth's skin stretched taut beneath the wet, coarse, dark brown paste, the funeral-like aroma rising close to her nostrils, causing her eyes to flutter. She felt the cold, damp cloth pressed firmly against her jaw, while the mushy meat lodged itself in her pores, a binding of power over her own flesh. In that instant, she did not merely confront her bodily fear. She heard the echoes of history, her mother's anguished screams, the harsh criticism of the court, and the invisible cheers of those awaiting her downfall. Time seemed to pause during the 15 to 20 minutes. The mask remained in place. Elizabeth closed her eyes, centered her breathing, and imagined each particle of rot drawing toxins from her skin, spurring fresh cells to life. Her mind became a barren garden where restless phantoms stirred. Yet she sensed her own strength. She was the master of decay's cycle, refining herself through destruction. As the meat began to dry, patches formed a scaly crust like rotting bark, producing soft, crackling sounds whenever she moved her face. At last, the servant used a damp cloth to wipe away the slime. Patches of goo, flecks of meat, and streaks of red blood washed into the gleaming ceramic basin. The sight of slime-stained gold brocade at her neck left an indelible mark, causing even the bravest courtiers to recoil. Shuddering at the disgust, Elizabeth gazed into the mirror, her features distorted. The white powdered complexion flecked with bruised pink where the mask had rubbed and felt a momentary void. Then she sighed, reminding herself that true power is not granted to the weak-hearted. In Elizabeth's mind, the rotten meat mask was more than a superficial, cleansing ritual. It was an act of defiance against nature itself. She wielded her own revulsion as a weapon to repel impurity and disease. Down the long corridor, the clop of wooden clogs echoed, and candlelight flickered over paintings of saints witnesses to the Queen's self-inflicted penance. She moved on in silence, leaving behind the stench of decay and the chill of authority. At that moment, Elizabeth's psychology was a curious blend of exhilaration and dread. Part of her felt pride in being the only one daring such an unthinkable act. Another part was ashamed at the body's endurance. As the slime splattered across her gown, she longed to scream for release, yet knew that silence was the monarchy's solemn vow. Thinking of her unseen enemies, she managed a pained smile. Fear and power intertwined within one soul. When the ritual ended and the rotten meat was washed away, Elizabeth stood before the mirror, wiping lingering droplets from her nose. Her skin burned and glowed in angry red patches, yet she felt reborn, cleansed in the most horrific manner. The clatter of the wooden door sliding open signaled the court's summoning for an audience. She drew a slow, steady breath, swept back her hair, reshaped her brows, and stepped into the brilliant candlelight with a face that had endured its most terrifying trial. The rotten meat mask had fulfilled its mission, protecting the immortal illusion she so fiercely guarded. Following the rotten meat mask ritual where Queen Elizabeth transformed revulsion into a weapon of power, we stepped down the cold stone corridors to the second rite, where her body melds with a thick, pungent fluid. Horrifying and depraved ritual, too, bathing in fermented urine. The Tudor hallway seemed to stretch on forever, candlelight silently reflecting every crack in the stone walls like wrinkles carved by time. The creak of wooden wheels accompanied two large earthenware vats as they rolled slowly into the draft-free bathing chamber. The air was so stifling that Queen Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat echo through the stone recesses. She paused, drew a deep breath, and steeled herself before confronting this bizarre ceremony. Urine, a liquid mortals normally hide in private, was now regarded as a miracle cure for royal skin. Elizabeth used her own urine, carefully collected in elegant porcelain flasks, or that of a loyal lady-in-waiting, aged in the sun for days. In the pale dawn light filtering through the tall windows, the grey vats sat in neat rows on the stone floor, the morning sun glinting off the golden, rippling surface of the liquid, giving it an almost ghostly glow. She walked forward in silence, as though stepping onto a platform to unearth a secret buried deep within her body. 10 minutes before the bath began, 3 or 4 servants in plain woolen tunics stood ready. One stirred the fermented liquid with a wooden paddle. Another ladled out a small dipperful and tested its warmth on her wrist. Queen Elizabeth slowly removed her garments, revealing skin as pale as parchment, beads of sweat glistening at her temples beneath the still visible white lead powder from the previous ritual. When she dipped her foot in, the cold liquid coiled around her ankle, sending a shudder through her frame. She held her breath and continued wading in until her body floated amidst the vat of golden ferment. Beneath the fermented urine, each pore seemed to clamp shut, contract, then open wide to receive the liquid's natural acidity and unseen microorganisms. Queen Elizabeth closed her eyes and listened within her mind to the rhythmic waves, a cacophony of sound like her flesh crying out under chemical assault. In that moment, she was no longer a mighty sovereign, but a fragile body besieged by a strange, sour, unscent brine. Time crawled by as an hourglass in the corner, measured each grain, marking a half-hour trial. Every time a servant ladled another dipperful, Elizabeth felt the liquid pour from her shoulders to her heels, pulsing between the folds of her skin like tiny rivulets of blood. An itch rippled from deep within, as though her skin were battling invisible bacteria and microbes. She clenched herself, determined not to grimace, to maintain regal composure before the horrified courtiers forced witnesses to this royal ordeal. Meanwhile, her mind drifted between past and present. She remembered the court physician's glowing praise for fermented urine baths, fading dark spots, tightened pores, supple elasticity. But under the taut, burning skin, she perceived the harsh truth. Her skin dried, flaked away in scales, and the itch never ceased. Ancient medical accolades echoed faintly, meaningless against the sensation of her flesh being torn apart from within. As the ritual drew to a close, a maid held a coarse, herb-scented cloth behind Elizabeth's neck, gently wiping away the fermented liquid from her body. Her warm, damp fingers soothed her shoulders and back, easing the tension that racked her. The faint aroma of lavender and rosemary, designed to mask the pungent ferment, grew faint in Elizabeth's mind. A fleeting comfort before reality reasserted itself. Although court records touted this method's ability to fade blemishes and tighten pores, Queen Elizabeth felt only agonizing consequences. Her skin raw, peeling in small flakes that fell like tears as she gazed into the crystal mirror beside the vat. In her blurred reflection, she saw herself a glorious queen, forced to endure a gruesome trial to uphold her illusion of power. When the rite concluded, Elizabeth carefully stepped from the vat. Droplets of fermented urine glistening on her skin like invisible weapons, reminding her of the price she paid for authority. Her mind brimmed with the pungent memories, the stirring of the liquid, the ladle tapping the vat's rim, the briny odor seeping into every cell. She reminded herself that true strength lay not only in crown or sword, but in the capacity to endure suffering no one else dared imagine. Finished, Elizabeth wrapped herself in a heavy cloak, her trembling hand wiping stray droplets from her neck, and emerged from the darkened chamber. The wooden wheels creaked as the servants whisked the vats away, candlelight flickering as if beckoning the powerful woman back to the splinters of her soul. In that lonely moment, she felt the depth of her isolation. Only she understood the cold, acrid cost required to preserve her immortal illusion before the world. And though her flesh wearied, Elizabeth pressed on amid the stench of ferment and the shadows of the court. She remained unbroken. Following the fermented bath ritual, in which the Queen offered her body to a viscous fluid, Elizabeth's footsteps guided her into a silent but no less haunting ceremony. The third horrifying and depraved habit, constantly changing undergarments instead of bathing, linen shift. At dawn, the Tudor palace awoke to the soft knock of a servant closing the door. The faint candlelight dancing across damp stone walls, still bearing traces of the night's mist. In a private corner, the wooden floorboards creaked under Elizabeth's light steps as she approached a tall oak wardrobe filled with hundreds of linen shifts, thin, skin-clinging undergarments, like an invisible armor. Each linen shift had been hand-washed, rinsed in scented herbal water, and hung in the morning sun to draw out impurities. Now, to keep her flesh from touching cold water, she placed her full trust in the ritual of replacing undergarments as a form of sacred cleansing every morning, while the dawn's light remained weak and the corridors lay silent. Elizabeth summoned her clothing attendants. They carried in bundles of neatly folded linen shifts, each exuding the fragrance of lavender, rosemary, and a few drops of rose essential oil, a delicate aroma designed to mask bodily odors. As soon as the old linen was removed from her skin, a servant discreetly carried it into the wooden bathing room, dropping it into a warm tub infused with comfrey leaves. Meanwhile, by flickering candlelight, Elizabeth donned the fresh linen, feeling as though she were putting on a new spiritual suit of armor. On some days, the linen-changing ritual occurred not just twice in the morning and evening, but 4 or even 5 times. Elizabeth's skin was in constant contact with fresh fabric, and each change brought a sigh of relief, as though her body had been cleansed anew. The gentle friction of the linen like a cool breeze that soothed an undercurrent of itchiness, She closed her eyes and imagined each fibre drawing out sweat, sebum, and hidden toxins, as if her skin were being purified through the thin cloth itself. But reality was far less comforting. Even after drying in the sun, the linen retained tiny droplets of moisture, creating an ideal breeding ground for mold and bacteria. The persistent itchiness along her spine and around her elbows often made Elizabeth steal glances at her fresh collar during court audiences, fearing that a sudden scratch might betray her regal composure. Yet she endured it, knowing that her outward dignity was the steadfast shield protecting her throne. In the dim light of the dressing room, the candles flickered, as if reminding her that time would not wait. Each linen shift was carefully folded and placed back into its compartment, marking the moment it became ready for the next service. The attendants worked in a precise order, one to prepare the herbal rinse, one to wash and wring, another to hang and dry, and a final one to fold, each step an indispensable link in the palace's hygiene ceremony. And each time new linen touched her flesh, Elizabeth felt a gentle surge of strength course through her, as if supported by the devoted ranks of her attendants. In the quiet moments when only the rustle of fabric remained, Elizabeth often gazed out the tall window at the trees swaying in the morning breeze. She wondered whether the thin cloth could truly shield her from the fear of internal uncleanliness. The image of a fresh linen shift stood for the illusion of perfect cleanliness. Yet deep within her soul, she feared that a single lapse might allow her body's odour to erupt and shatter every carefully plotted display of power. Occasionally, a courtier was permitted into the chamber, bearing compliments on the fragrant linen. Elizabeth would offer a polite smile, her eyes sparkling, but inside she was a tangle of anxiety, afraid that her terror might be discovered beneath the pristine undergarment. The fear of being exposed by a stray odour became more haunting than ever, compelling her to treat the linen shift as an inviolable talisman. Then, every evening, as dusk fell, the linen-changing ritual repeated itself. Elizabeth quietly removed the fabric that had hugged her skin. Observing the sweat-darkened patches and inhaling the mingled scent of body odour and herbs, she then donned a fresh shift, feeling reborn. Her body cloaked once more in a vibrant layer of cloth, but it was only temporary. When fatigue and stress set in at night, she knew she would descend again into the linen vault's depths and repeat the ritual once more. In truth, the linen shift was more than a means of surface cleanliness. It was a spiritual rite in which Elizabeth entrusted her faith to purity that transcended her faltering body. She used the linen as a secret shell, convincing herself that as long as the cloth remained clean, she could never be sullied. The candlelight trembling beside the linen rack and the night breeze whispering through the shutters seemed to murmur reminders of loneliness. Only she carried out this ritual, while the world saw only the proud figure of the queen. Sometimes, when the final linen shift had been removed before nightfall, Elizabeth realized that the cloth itself was the sole companion privy to her deepest fear. Its fading herbal scent gave way to a temporary confidence. She stood there, in the silent chamber, clutching the clean linen, her eyes alight with resolve. Whatever terrifying trial lay ahead, she would endure it. For sovereignty did not allow weakness. And so, the linen shift ritual concluded. Yet the memory of fabric against flesh, the odour of ferment, and the scent of herbs lingered in Elizabeth's mind. She returned to the great hall, her wooden heels tapping lightly on the threshold, donning the chrysanthemum-embroidered velvet cloak awaiting her. In the palace's dark expanse, only the soft rustle of coarse linen followed her steps. A mournful piano, refrain whispering of solitude and the stark power of an inviolable queen. Following the linen shift ritual where Queen Elizabeth I found a false warmth beneath layers of pure fabric, the fourth depraved ceremony led Queen Elizabeth I into an even more windswept labyrinth, where power and fear entwined tightly. Horrifying and depraved habit 4. Applying white-lead face masks, Venetian ceruse. The air in the dressing chamber still carried a chill from the half-drawn velvet drapes, candlelight flickering like tiny torches, illuminating every corner of the palace. Outside, rain pattered against the brick tower, whispering reminders to Queen Elizabeth I that time never ceases its march. Queen Elizabeth I stood before the intricately inlaid bronze mirror, remnants of yesterday's powder caked on her skin, and silently told herself, "Tonight, you must be more perfect." And the sparkling white lead powder was prepared in a delicate porcelain bowl, a servant measuring each spoonful of ceruse, fine as licorice dust, mixing it with pure grape vinegar to bind it. The powder, as absorbent as cotton, gripped every pore when applied, transforming Queen Elizabeth I visage into a flawless porcelain mask. The goal was a milky white complexion, without blemish, reflecting candlelight like an unbreakable mirror. Yet from the very first touch, Queen Elizabeth I first failed. I felt the mask's cold creep across her skin, as if an invisible hand whispered, "I am drowning this flesh." How her fingers trembled as the servant dabbed cotton pads and gently smoothed ceruse over her cheekbones, brow, and down to her jawline. The fragile skin stretched taut beneath the opaque white compound, glimmering in the candlelight as though her face were being pieced together with tiny shards of porcelain. She heard the old court physician's voice echo in her mind. "Add more vinegar for longer adhesion. Add more powder to conceal every crease." Queen Elizabeth, I clenched her lips, listening as her skin dried, the powder forming raised ridges that crumbled like flawed bricks, cascading onto her golden robe. As the white powder hardened, Queen Elizabeth I closed her eyes and imagined her portrait hanging in the gallery, a sovereign of unassailable authority. Her skin bala asyade, her gaze unwavering. Each layer of ceruse acted like armor against time. She envisioned cruel wrinkles being crushed, each crow's feet line ground into the shell, allowing herself a measure of pride. No mark can betray my age. Infirme. But the first sensation of lead penetrating her skin was a dull itch, like 1,000 pinpricks. Then came the stinging, spreading as the ceruse dried into rigid patches that cracked, revealing raw, flushed flesh beneath. Queen Elizabeth I dared not move, terrified of shattering her perfect mask. In that moment, her mind split in two, one part thrilled by the illusion of escaping decay, the other tormented by the pain gnawing at every cell. Court gossip claimed that a mere brush against her skin would send powder flaking off like fragile paper, exposing cracked, dehydrated patches. In the corner, the attendants remained silent witnesses, eyes fixed on every motion. Queen Elizabeth I felt each gaze like candle flames scorching her pride. Compelling her to endure, she squeezed her eyes shut, picturing Leeds destruction weaving through the smallest pores, tearing cell structures. Yet she carried on washing her face and reapplying fresh ceruse in a ritual of rebirth. The long-term consequences began to surface. Dizziness, exhaustion, her mind weighed down by lead's burden. Whenever the court physician pressed a vial of antidote to her temple, she felt the cold remedy shatter the cells in pain. Yet her heart whispered, "How long will this strength last?" Sleepless nights stretched on as Queen Elizabeth I lay on her velvet bed, hand trembling as she rubbed her temple, gazing at the dim flicker of the oil lamp, wondering, is this the price of glory or chains that bind my soul? Yet every morning, Queen Elizabeth I's skin reappeared, smooth and white as marble. Her unblemished face, radiating sovereign majesty, she stepped through the door, her wooden heels echoing boldly across the royal hall, presenting a flawless emissary of beauty. Inside, relentless pain still lurked beneath the ceruse, reminding her that only illusions are immortal, while mortal flesh must perish. And so the ceruse ritual ended, but the traces of white lead lingered in Queen Elizabeth I's mind like a scar etched with a vow. Her crown would not falter, no matter the cost. In the creak of a wooden door, Her silhouette passed the gallery of portraits, and as the final candle guttered out, only an invisible, weighty layer of lead powder remained a debt of power Queen Elizabeth I could never repay. Following the white lead mask ritual, Queen Elizabeth I plunged into yet another bizarre ceremony where the vivid red of her lips became both a symbol of power and a slow-acting poison coursing through her veins. Horrific and depraved habit 5. Applying mercury, laced cinnabar lipstick. Dusk shadows draped the great hall as Queen Elizabeth thirst. I entered her private dressing chamber, where flickering candlelight danced across ancestral portraits. The air was heavy with the scent of ebony and lingering perfume oils clinging to the paneling. On a silver tray before her stood a jar of cinnabar, a bright red mercury powder condensed from precious ore. Queen Elizabeth I regarded that scarlet pigment, recalling the royal apothecary's words, "Only cinnabar lipstick yields a lasting crimson fit to captivate every gaze." She sighed, hiding her fear. This red is sovereignty. Yet it may also be a curse. 01. A deft servant scooped the fine, velvety cinnabar powder and blended it with a few drops of precious almond oil, creating a thick paste. Each motion played out in silence, except for the soft whisper of a wooden spoon against the porcelain bowl. Queen Elizabeth. I bowed her head, revealing bare lips untouched by colour. As the servant applied a base layer of oil, she felt her lips warm, as though sensing the pulsing heartbeat of power. Then the scarlet cinnabar was smoothed on thickly, sinking into every crease. That red was unlike any ordinary lipstick, fiery, dazzling. A challenge hurled at time and adversaries alike. As soon as the first layer set, Queen Elizabeth I closed her eyes and imagined herself before a mirror. Blood, red lips on a white canvas. A silent declaration of war against the world. She tasted the pungent sting at the corners of her mouth, a reminder of mercury's toxicity, yet she smiled. This was the royal visage where power and death intertwined. She remembered the first time she forgot to remove the lipstick by morning. Her lips were swollen and burning, rendering speech nearly impossible. In her dizziness, she scolded herself. A queen cannot leave a trace, must never let her lips lose their scent. End of roman. With each reapplication, Queen Elizabeth, I confronted the sensation of mercury penetrating her skin and seeping into her bloodstream. Headaches rang in her ears. Fleeting dizziness followed. And then uncontrollable mood swings. Outbursts of fury, floods of regret. Royal physicians recorded that on one occasion she postponed audiences for hours, reclining on her silk-draped bed, clutching a vial of vinegar and honey concocted to detoxify her. She listened to the gentle pour of vinegar, gauging when the toxin would subside, yet still pictured that same brilliant red sowing devastation within, deep inside. Queen Elizabeth I wrestled with conflicting desires. Part of her craved the flawless mask. Part dreaded mercury's torment. At night, she lay on a silk pillow, incense smoke flickering off the vaulted ceiling, her lips still crimson as lacquered gold. In her hand, she held a secret journal, noting the persistent tingling beneath her lip skin, recording her fatigue and moments of confusion. Is this crimson worth my life? Yet in the same breath she would grin with pride. Lips are weapons, and weapons must be sharp. Hygiene style. At dawn's first light, Queen Elizabeth I stepped onto her balcony, bright lips shining against a grey sky. Courtiers formed two reverent lines, their eyes fixed upon her. Every greeting, every glance reminded her of the power her lips commanded. Outside, flutes and violins played in harmony with the heartbeat of a monarch. But deep within, she felt her veins constrict. How could she govern an empire while bearing poison in her own arsenal of beauty? When night fell, Queen Elizabeth I returned to her dressing chamber, reapplying colour to faded lips, layering on fresh cinnabar. The soft brush strokes echoed like a ticking clock counting down her days. Each new layer was another sacrifice of flesh, another reaffirmation of her sovereign image's immortality. Though she knew mercury flowed through her veins, she could not abandon this ritual. It was her oath to the crown, proof she would not flinch at the brink of life and death. When the lipstick ritual concluded, Queen Elizabeth I's face glowed like a star against the night sky. She paced the stone corridors in wooden heels, her scarlet lips accentuating each determined step. In the dark, the last candle guttered out, leaving only the faint scent of almond oil and the bitter trace of cinnabar. She knew well that the red she wore would continue to seep into her blood, granting her power while reminding her of indelible pain, a pain only Queen Elizabeth I could fully comprehend. Following the cinnabar lipstick ritual where Queen Elizabeth I wielded crimson as a spear against time, she stepped into yet another shadowed corridor, where the sound of teeth grinding echoed like the ticking of a fate countdown clock. Horrific and depraved habit. 6. Brushing her teeth with charcoal and honey. At dawn's first light filtering through the tall windows, a beam slipped past the silk drapes and fell upon an aged wooden table, where a porcelain bowl held ebony-grey charcoal dust blended with golden honey. In the hushed calm, broken only by the distant clatter of the kitchen staff stoking the fire, Queen Elizabeth I approached slowly and traced a fingertip through the mixture, an aroma of burnt wood and early spring nectar mingling, as though daring her to confront the terror hidden behind this most mundane ritual. Dental hygiene. Her ivory teeth, chipped and riddled with black decay, and the occasional sour tang of her breath, had long been a whispered dread among the courtiers shared only in her absence. Yet Queen Elizabeth I refused to abandon this bizarre practice. Gripping a single-use hog-hair toothbrush later burned to prevent infection, she scooped a pinch of glowing charcoal dust and kneaded it into the honey in her palm until it formed a dense, resin-like paste. With each swirl, she stifled a sigh. This was no mere cleansing, but a duel with her own flesh. Seated before her mirror, lips parted just enough for the brush, Queen Elizabeth I began to work the abrasive charcoal into her teeth. The rasping sound of charcoal scouring enamel rang out in the stillness, notes of grim music heralding destruction. The honey, sticky and sweet, masked stains and lent a fleeting freshness to her breath. In that moment, her mind drifted to the proud, youthful image she once was, now tormented by the ceaseless rasp of bristles and the shattering fragility of her worn enamel. Each stroke of the brush was a fresh reminder of charcoal grinding away enamel. Flecks fell into the bowl like ebony snow. Queen Elizabeth I squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to grimace, despite her lips trembling from smoke and sweetness, intermingling, be candlelight. The black smudges at the corners of her mouth marked mistakes that could not be concealed. She resolved to endure, believing that only through relentless cleansing could she prevent her breath from betraying her before her subjects. But the terrible consequences loomed. Her enamel wore away, leaving teeth rough as pumice and more prone to staining than ever. The honey, which briefly concealed discoloration, fed bacteria, deepening the decay. Queen Elizabeth I found herself trapped in a vicious cycle. The harder she scrubbed, the more enamel she lost, the more decay spread. The more violent her brushing had to become. Her mind felt like a bottomless mill, grinding away any hope of preserving a bright smile. In sleepless nights, she lay on her velvet bed, fingers trembling as she caressed the singed remains of her toothbrush, recalling the sting of charcoal in her gums. She heard the palace clock ticking, each second eroding another sliver of enamel. The fear of being defeated by her own teeth became entwined with the spectre of the crown. Could she govern an empire if she lacked the courage even to smile? Court records note that on some days Queen Elizabeth I paused mid-brushing, dabbed the sticky honey from her lips, and wept quietly. Yet she would bow her head, take a steadying breath, and continue, because her teeth were not merely tools for eating but symbols of sovereignty. A smile revealed authority, But that smile existed only if her teeth endured this ritual. At first light, Queen Elizabeth I emerged into the Great Hall, her breath slightly uneven, yet her gaze unwavering. Though she knew each brushing chipped away at her dwindling enamel, she accepted the trade-off. Sovereignty, she understood, demanded sacrifice even of one's own flesh to uphold an untouchable illusion. Ash evening, the Queen returned to her darkened chamber to brush once more before beginning her other beauty rites. Charcoal and honey were mixed again. The hoghair brush worked in steady rhythm, like the palace clock ticking down each moment. This was the mournful song of a monarch, a requiem for power, solitude, and self-destruction. When the ritual finally concluded, Queen Elizabeth I looked into the mirror, her teeth now splintered and blackened. Her smile diminished, yet her eyes still fierce. She reminded herself that, however steep the price, she would never allow anyone to see her weakness. In the dark corridor, the rustle of silk and the echo of wooden heels served as a reminder that every step of Queen Elizabeth I's reign was shielded by a veneer of power crafted. In this case, from charcoal and sweet honey. So we've now traversed the 6 most horrifying hygiene rituals, unveiling the darkest secrets behind Queen Elizabeth I's facade of power. But her life wasn't defined solely by masks, poison, and peculiar toothbrushes. She also maintained terrifying habits around eating, sleeping, and resting that few dare to mention. Next, let us uncover the 3 most grisly secrets of her diet, slumber, and daily routine. So we can understand more clearly the price paid for that immortal throne. Let us now explore the first shocking dietary habit, eating fermented insects. As dawn's first light crept behind the palace windows, Queen Elizabeth I was told that the large wooden casks in the fermentation cellar were ready. Once used for wine, they had now housed larvae and insects fermenting for weeks. The flickering candles in the stone basement highlighted streaks of sour lees, redolent of mildew. The Queen entered, sensing the heavy air of alcohol fumes mingled with the acrid odor of decaying insects. She uttered not a word, reminding herself that this act was a talisman to protect her health against any epidemic. Before her, a servant brought a flat wooden platter holding swollen insect clusters. The crisp shells crumbled at a touch, revealing the mushy larval innards. A pungent sourness rose, mingling with the distinctive rank stench of decomposing bugs. The Queen regarded each insect calmly, though inside she reeled. Beads of sweat on her temples reminded her that, even as monarch, her body remained fragile before disease. When the servant set the platter down, Queen Elizabeth, I sat upright, lifting it close to her nose for a deep inhalation. The tang of fermentation and the insect fumes assaulted her senses. A chill breeze from a crack in the cellar wall swept over her, threatening to stir hidden fears. Each insect was a challenge to her very self, and yet also a precious medicine against flu and smallpox. The silence was broken only by the soft popping of fermentation bubbles in the cask. Creating a macabre rhythm for the ritual, Queen Elizabeth I lifted the first insect toward her mouth. Her teeth bit down hard, the shell cracked crisply, and the inner pulp oozed like runny mortar. The initial flavor was the sour heat of the lees on her tongue, followed by a stark fishiness interwoven with the rich fat of the insect. She chewed decisively, keeping her lips sealed to silence any sound. Her gaze fixed on the wall mirror, her pale face, determined bright eyes, and the small silk-embroidered beard tube heightening her regal composure. Thinking of each insect, Queen Elizabeth, I felt her stomach churn, but she steeled her resolve. Every chew was a rebirth. Every sour tang, a natural antibiotic. She believed the microorganisms in the larvae stimulated her immune system, drawing toxins out from within. In that moment, revulsion turned to spiritual strength. She vowed that nothing could conquer her, not even the smallest of creatures. After swallowing the first morsel, Queen Elizabeth I cleared her throat and signalled for a flask of potent herbal wine mixed with vinegar. A single warm sip banished the fishy aftertaste, warming her throat and cleansing her palate. She lifted her head, her eyes drifting to the vaulted ceiling, where the stone arch was darkened by thick green moss. Silently she wondered, is the fear of illness greater than this disgust? The answer echoed like a command. No, for revulsion must overcome fear. End quote. Next, she chewed a second insect. The crisp shell and viscous lees sang out in a staccato crackle, like a victory drum announcing survival. She tasted the lees' lingering sourness, the wine and herb bouquet, and a faint sweetness of honey. In Queen Elizabeth I, mind hovered visions of the dusty halls of the Royal Library, where physicians recorded herbal formulas. She reminded herself that each insect was a harvest of ancient medical knowledge, a testament to her timeless wisdom. Yet a dull ache spread, her belly twisted, and her guts knotted in revolt. The servant beside her silently offered a vial of natural antidote vinegar and honey to sip and soothe the discomfort. The cycle repeated: chew the insect, swallow the lees, sip the wine, take the antidote like a circle with no exit. Queen Elizabeth, I knew this vicious loop well, yet never allowed herself to relent. She monitored each breath, feeling the warmth unfurl in her lungs, forcing a wry smile despite the briny sting on her lips. At last, after a mound of chewed insects lay half-finished, Queen Elizabeth I pushed the platter aside. She rose, stretching like a victor, her bare feet meeting the biting cold of the stone floor, intensifying her sense of being alive. In the dim light, the chill wind from the cellar door washed over her face, as if cleansing away the stale insect odor and sour lees. She closed her eyes, gripping her gown's hem, feeling her entire being purified by this most harrowing act. Upon leaving the cellar, Queen Elizabeth I knew she had completed the day's most potent ritual. She mounted the stairs, each footstep echoing with authority, proclaiming her unshakable power. Deep in her heart, she carried the tang of sour lees and the aftertaste of insects, a residue of a depraved custom interwoven with her ambition for immortality. And through that very revulsion, Queen Elizabeth I found the strength to conquer her fear of disease, affirming that her dynasty would endure. Following the horrific fermented insect ritual, Queen Elizabeth I did not allow her spirit to remain subdued for long. At the blazing midday hour, she turned to a different ceremony, confronting her deepest fear head-on: the coffin noon rest. Her attendants respectfully carried in a small coffin crafted from the finest oak, its wood grain undulating like the wrinkles of time. Flickering in the weak candlelight, they set it upon a stone dais in the silent chamber, where only the distant toll of the palace clock echoed like the heartbeat of destiny. Queen Elizabeth. I stepped forward and felt her chest suddenly tighten, as if a pool of darkness had unexpectedly spread within. She bent over and peered into the coffin's interior, a pitch-black cavity lined with thin felt, a cushion of worn dark velvet. The space inside could barely contain a frail body. Candlelight glinted off the coffin lid, tracing a thin line between life and death. The Queen hesitated, gripping her silk-wrapped beard, focusing on the echo of her own breathing. A servant gently lifted the lid, releasing the scent of aged wood and musty mold, the fragrance of earth and memory. The stifling air of the burial chamber seeped into her lungs, pressing heavily on her chest. The first sensation was a surge of pressure crushing her lungs, as if she were about to be crushed by her own fear. Yet Queen Elizabeth I closed her eyes and reminded herself, "Only by touching the edge of death can I hold fast to the living throne." She sat down, knees brushing the coffin's edge, and the servant skillfully closed the lid. Outside, a beam of midday light pierced the high window and fell upon the stone floor. Inside the wooden chamber, only impenetrable darkness remained. The Queen's breathing echoed, accompanied by her racing heartbeat, every sense sharpened. Hearing each crack of oak contracting in the heat, the confined space seemed intent on suffocating her mind. Queen Elizabeth I's thoughts wandered into a labyrinth where every exit had vanished. Under the weight of darkness and damp wood, her fear of death spread like poison. Each breath became a test of her limits. I am still alive. I can still endure. In that slender moment between life and death, the Queen experienced a strange sensation, deep-seated fear, awakening her iron will. She vowed, "If I can overcome this moment, nothing can subdue my power." The darkness surrounding her was not merely a tomb, but a trial, affirming the throne's immortality. Time slowed. Every second stretched into eternity. Outside, the palace clock struck 9 strokes, marking midday. Inside the coffin, only gasping breaths, and a heartbeat like a war drum remained. Queen Elizabeth I. Each tremor, each pulse a declaration of war against death. She had no right to falter. As the trial neared its end, the servant gently lifted the lid. Blinding midday light flooded the wooden chamber, dispelling the pitch-black gloom. Queen Elizabeth I drew a deep breath, as if surfacing from the abyss. Fresh air sized her lungs, and she exhaled in a long sigh of release. She straightened, placing her foot on the cold stone dais, feeling the solid ground beneath her bare skin. The contrast between darkness and light, between death and life, renewed Queen Elizabeth, as unyielding resolve. She understood that true power did not lie solely in throne or sword, but in the ability to conquer one's deepest fears. Though the coffin noon rest ritual lasted only a few minutes, it left an indelible mark on her psyche. Each repetition drew Queen Elizabeth I closer to her physical and spiritual limits. Emerging through the dungeon door, she carried both horror and newfound strength, a bizarre fusion of fear and pride. Under the bright glow of the great hall's chandeliers, Queen Elizabeth I appeared as a living monument. Onlookers beheld her refreshed countenance and calm demeanor, unaware that she had just endured suffocating moments beneath the earth. Within her, fear still resided, but it had been mastered and transformed into unwavering determination. When this ritual concluded, Queen Elizabeth I awaited the next challenges of the day, further ceremonies to sustain her authority, yet few knew that, under the scorching midday sun, she had confined herself in a coffin where death seemed imminent, never allowing the reaper to triumph. For her, that act was not self-destruction, but proof of an enduring power that transcends all fear. Following the coffin noon rest ritual, as the midday light waned and the palace fell silent awaiting evening, Queen Elizabeth I undertook yet another trial, sleeping upright upon her throne, lest any sign of weakness show itself before the court. In the dusky throne room, incense coils burned and candles flickered beneath the lofty arches. A deep red tapestry carpet covered the floor. Yet Elizabeth I refused to lower herself onto its plush surface. She insisted on sitting bolt upright on the gilded throne, her back pressed firmly against the elaborately carved wood, determined not to slump and betray her exhaustion. Each night, after the wooden heels of the courtiers had faded away, leaving only the soft rustle of velvet drapes against polished columns, the Queen kept her eyes half open. She did not do so out of curiosity, but because if she closed them fully, her body would relax, inevitably slacken, and reveal her fatigue. Thus, she allowed her eyelids only the faintest droop, ensuring the flame in the corner remained in her line of sight. Her back felt as if it were nailed to the throne's splendor. After many nights without lying down, her shoulders ached, as though stretched by countless cords. Her spine, rigid and unyielding. Each minute of attempted repose, another blow to her bones and joints. Yet Elizabeth I did not flinch. She was prepared to endure pain in order to preserve her indomitable image. In the spectral gloom, the throne became a silent arena. She sat there, royal finery gleaming outwardly, a gaunt body inside, craving the comfort of a soft bed. Her mind drifted to her mother's nightmares, to times when shaken power had once left her trembling. Now, the wind and rain outside whispered through the arched window, as if urging her not to relent. Queen Elizabeth I's eyes would sometimes fully close, only to snap wide at the realization that her posture slackened. Candlelight danced on her wimple and cheekbones, slicing her face into sculptural half-shadows. She imagined tears welling up if she let her guard down, but she held them back, treating the ache as a reminder. Only those who betray no hint of weakness truly deserve power. Against that tableau, every breath she took rang louder than the palace clock's chimes. A quiet inhale, a gentle exhale like a severe meditation practice. She counted each second, telling herself that every moment of wakefulness was a hammer striking fate. Only by conquering sleep could she prove her throne unshakable. As the night deepened, the faint creak of an empty corridor startled her. No ladies in waiting or courtiers remained in sight, only her solitude beside the throne. She perceived every ghostly flicker of candle flame and sensed the carpet pulsing in time with her heartbeat. All seemed to conspire against her resolve. In the late hours, her body shivered when a mouse scurried through the shadows or a bat's wings brushed against the tower, each sound reminding her how precarious her pride was. Yet she lifted her chin, envisioning herself as an unyielding citadel amid the storm, unmoved by the tremors at her feet. On many nights, Elizabeth I heard raindrops patter on the tiled roof and imagined them soaking through her silk gown. But she dared not stir toward a bed. She told herself that if she bent down to escape the rain, the court would see her as mortal and doubt the throne's potency. At last, dawn's first rays broke through the great hall's windows while she still sat upon the throne, spent but resolute. Dewdrops glistened on the heavy drapes, reminding her she had survived a long night of bodily torment. Dark circles marked her cheeks, her lips set in a firm line. Yet Elizabeth I felt triumphant in having met this mortal test. When the courtiers reassembled in the hall for the morning audience, Queen Elizabeth I rose slowly. Back pain and spinal stiffness welled up within her, but she kept her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. To all, she appeared sturdy. Yet few knew she had just endured a sleepless vigil upon her throne. Her ritual of sleeping upright on the throne was not merely a display of regal poise, but a self-imposed proving ground against fear. With each breath taken while awake upon the seat of power, she reaffirmed her pledge. No weakness would ever mar her reign. Though her body ached with fatigue, her mind remained as sharp as ever. She understood that the throne was not mere ornament, but the very essence of her being that she must defend at all costs. Perched upright, she declared that even if her flesh faltered, her will would never yield. And so, as the morning light flooded the hall, Queen Elizabeth I, her dark circles visible but her bearing majestic, strode across the stone floor. She had already conquered the fear of sleep, and through that act asserted her power's eternal endurance. Following the ordeal of sleeping upright on her throne, Queen Elizabeth, I seemed to sink ever deeper into the whirlpool of harsh rituals meant to reinforce her indomitable image. But those very practices exacted a heavy toll on her body and mind. Physically, Elizabeth's flesh did not only suffer erosion from white lead powder and rotten meat masks, it had become fragile and hypersensitive to every change in temperature. Years of ceruse, eating away at her epidermis, left pitted scars across her face, reducing her skin's elasticity and making it prone to irritation. Her mercury-laced Cinnabar lipstick, though vividly red for the public, produced inflamed, ulcerated lips that frequently peeled and bled. Decades of brushing her teeth with charcoal and honey destroyed her enamel, leaving her teeth rough, cracked, and blackened. The royal physicians once attempted to rebuild her enamel with natural vitamin pastes, but to no avail. By the end of her life, Elizabeth's teeth were nothing more than fragile shards, and her breath carried the sour sting of fermented sugars and decay. Her nervous system suffered just as gravely. Dizziness, headaches, and psychological disturbances tormented her through many sleepless nights. So much so that courtiers first noticed her eyes darkening after audiences. Beginning in 1580, subtle tremors crept into her limbs at first, a light twitch while listening to reports, then escalating into uncontrollable shakes. Once, in the middle of a council meeting, her hand trembled violently, and she gripped the governor's arm for support. On another occasion, she sat open-mouthed and dazed, eyes rolling back in her head, startling all who witnessed it. Mentally, Elizabeth was wounded deeply. Courtiers often saw her drifting through the palace with dark circles under hollow eyelids. At midnight, she would grope down silent corridors, slap a maid's shoulder, and demand, "Bring the fragrant wine," only to stand quietly inhaling its heady fumes to quell a panic attack. In moments of unprovoked fury, she flung her planning journal against the stone wall, then immediately knelt to apologize when composure returned. Occasionally, she would slip into inexplicable despair, tears welling in her eyes as she withdrew into silence, asking herself, is all this suffering worth the throne? Under the unrelenting strain of illness and expectation, the court physicians resorted to herbal tinctures, potent charms, and music therapy to soothe her spirit. They brewed cinnamon, star anise, and rosemary into fortified wine for her to hold before bedtime, prompting a fragile smile. Nothing more. A lute often played slow, mournful melodies in her chamber, intended to calm her mind. Yet when the final note faded, she remained wide awake, eyes fixed in vigilance. Despite her obvious decline, Elizabeth I concealed her condition. She even punished anyone who dared mention her health. An icy glare or a softly spoken rebuke was enough to make a servant swallow the words. To her, immortal sovereignty had to remain a secret. Only flawless perfection deserved the throne. Over time, the complications grew more pronounced. Chronic insomnia disrupted her sleep patterns, dozing during the day, pacing at night, eating erratically. Depression sometimes swallowed her whole, shutting her away in her private suite for days. When she did appear before court, she forced a bright countenance and sparkling eyes. Yet hours later, she might sit statue still, hands trembling, staring blankly into the shadows. Her fading spirit also manifested in a change of temperament. Once witty and perceptive, Elizabeth became suspicious and quick to believe rumors. She tightened security, ordering guards to arrest suspected thieves, and watched every bow for signs of defiance. Even her closest confidantes had to tread lightly, fearful that a single misstep would draw her wrath. Yet in public she never revealed her deteriorating health. At every audience, she donned a pearl-studded velvet robe that gleamed in the torchlight, scented her hands with a blend of essential oils, and moved with the grace of a porcelain statue. She deployed her diplomatic wit to mask her exhaustion. But the courtiers, delivering petitions, could not help but notice the dark hollows beneath her eyes, a silent plea for concern for England's sovereign. As the years passed, the price of her quest for an immortal facade became unbearably steep. Her nervous system frayed, her body weakened, and her heart bore a loneliness no one could touch. Though she maintained her power outwardly, Queen Elizabeth I endured relentless physical and mental agony, a taut, invisible cord stretched to its limit, threatening to snap and undo her entire reign. By the end of her life, as the dynasty began to falter, Elizabeth I remained only a relic of a once proud era. Though her portraits still capture the regal posture and confident smile of a queen, those who had witnessed her struggles knew the truth. Behind that commanding gaze lay a weary soul and a body utterly spent. Thus, despite her courtiers' reverence, posterity came to understand that even immortal power must be bought with fragile health and a spirit scarred by unhealed wounds. Following the brutal rituals and the physical and psychological toll they exacted from Queen Elizabeth I, another silent force remained at work: the royal household staff and their secret procedures. The unseen figures responsible for every horrific act that had become part of the royal ceremonies. I.e., behind the sumptuous velvet drapes stood a service team numbering in the dozens, each member standing watch at least once around the clock. At the forefront were the court apothecaries, those most sensitive even to the revolting stench of fermented meat. They tirelessly ground every herb and measured vinegar and white lead powder to within 0.1 grams. Every recipe was inscribed in indelible ink on vellum pages and locked away in thick oak cabinets, accessible only to a handful of trusted servants sworn to absolute secrecy. At dawn, as the palace came alive with activity, the makeup artists would take shifts, opening the cabinets to retrieve jars of ceruse, pots of cinnabar, and containers of charcoal. They were the most meticulous artisans in the realm, required to memorize every step of the hygiene protocols before and after application, donning leather gloves and odor-blocking masks so they would not succumb to the fumes mid-shift. The fetid smell of fermented meat was so overpowering that one member once fainted and had to be revived with a cold compress and a draught of herbal wine. Next came the attendants charged with hauling buckets of fermented urine throughout the palace. They walked barefoot on the cold stone corridors, quietly collecting each vessel of yellowed liquid and pouring it into wooden basins placed wherever the queen waited. Every bucket was tested for pH, color, and aroma, because even 1% of contamination could ruin the ritual and endanger Her Majesty's health. The clinking of water against wood echoed off the stone walls, blending with the acrid fumes to create a dirge-like melody reminiscent of a mortuary. A special decontamination squad stood by at all times, equipped with sprayers of spiced wine and bandages soaked in antidotes. Should an accident occur, they watched every motion of the team and were ready to intervene at a moment's notice. If the queen showed signs of lead poisoning or infection, if but a drop of ceruse landed in her eye, the decontaminators would immediately spritz it with cinnamon-scented wine to sterilize the area, then gently wipe it clean with linen cloths that had been heat-sterilized over coals. Each new recruit to this inner circle was required to swear an oath of loyalty on their very first day, before a floral canopy. They placed their right hand upon the Bible and recited, "The secrets of the crown are my life." Anyone who betrayed those secrets by omitting an ingredient, revealing a recipe, or slipping a word to an outsider would be stripped of rank, dismissed from service, or even exiled from court. No one dared slacken their vigilance, even if the work's grisly nature robbed them of sleep. The team's responsibilities extended beyond mere mixing. They also oversaw the storage of every ingredient. Fermented meat was kept in a damp cellar where temperature and humidity were strictly controlled to prevent deadly molds. White lead powder sat sealed in glass vials within dry oak drawers, guarded against woodworm and moisture. Cinnabar, the mercury-laden mineral, was locked in lead-lined chests, each box stamped with its receipt date and final allowable use date. Any container past its prime was immediately destroyed. The charcoal and honey toothbrushing implements were treated as ritual objects. Hog hair brushes were sterilized in herbal solution, flame purified, and fully air-dried before use. After a single brushing, the brush was tossed into a miniature crematorium behind the bathhouse to eliminate all bacterial risk. The charcoal itself was sourced from palace fires burning ebony and oak at 800 degrees Celsius to remove impurities and ensure the finest texture. Within these secret chambers, the air was redolent with dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, and vervain meant to mask the revolting odors of the ingredients. Vegetable oil lamps burned low, their yellow glow flickering across the stone walls. Each staff member felt as though they were walking through a tunnel of time, their senses relentlessly tested. When a ritual concluded, the staff performed a cleansing sequence, wiping down wooden tables with herbal vinegar, sterilizing bowls and platters, laundering cloths, and burning used gloves and masks. The stench of rotten meat, the tang of fermentation, the sharp bite of lead powder, and the acrid sting of charcoal gradually gave way to a fresh herbal scent, but the memory of their grisly labors remained etched in every participant's mind. These secrets passed on only in hushed whispers. No chronicle recorded them. No ledger bore their traces. With each generation, only a select few apprentices who served a full 5 years were entrusted with the recipes. This was more than a job. It was a dark legacy running parallel to the throne's radiant splendor. It was thanks to this devoted staff and their painstaking clandestine procedures that Queen Elizabeth I maintained the illusion of immortality. Despite the horrifying nature of her rituals, yet that silent entourage also bore witness to every pang of suffering, every rancid odor, and every whispered fear forming a shadowy curtain behind a brilliantly lit throne. Finally, we didn't delve into Queen Elizabeth, as bizarre and sometimes horrifying habits to criticize her, but to marvel at the strength of will and vision of a woman who transformed fear into a tool of power, making her body and soul into an immortal symbol. No matter how gruesome the details, we meticulously compiled them from a wealth of royal archives, chronicles, and academic research solely to paint a complete portrait of Elizabeth, a legend who transcends her era. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the little-told corners of history. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. And don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated on our newest, most captivating videos about the historical figures you love. See you in our next stories.